So I want you to imagine for a second that you're exploring this abandoned bunker,
Hmm?
and you stumble upon a highly detailed, incredibly complex manual,
Okay.
right? And it's a blueprint for building and safely operating a massive nuclear reactor.
So we're talking schematics, equations, all that.
Exactly. It is filled with thermodynamic equations, fail-safes, structural requirements. But instead of handing this manual over to a team of, systems engineers and physicists who can actually build the thing, you hand it over to a group of poets.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah, or like literary critics. And they sit down and they just start reading it. They appreciate the rhythm of the words control rod and coolant.
Right, they treat it like art.
Right. They chant the thermodynamic equations around a campfire because, honestly, the math just sounds melodic to them. They memorize the warning labels. They might even recite them beautifully every single morning.
But they don't actually build anything.
Exactly. They never actually pour the concrete. They never build the containment facility. Because if you treat a manual for a nuclear reactor like a collection of poetry to be recited, rather than, an operating system to be executed, you're not going to get power. You are going to get a meltdown.
That is a profoundly accurate image for what we are tackling today.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's exactly the kind of catastrophic mishandling we see when profound blueprints for civilizational survival are mistaken for mere spiritual comfort.
Right.
When you confuse an engineering schematic for a hymnal, you don't just miss the point, you endanger the entire society.
And that is exactly what we are dismantling for you today. Welcome to a deep dive that is going to take a completely different lens to an ancient text.
It's a completely unsentimental lens.
Exactly. To do this, we're looking at a fascinating stack of linguistic research and historical analyses provided by you, the listener. Specifically, we are diving into the sociological interpretations laid out by G.A. Parwez and the Tului Islam corpus.
Which is incredibly dense, but so rewarding.
So rewarding. Today, our mission is to read Surah Al-Mu'minun, specifically the first 4 verses of chapter 23. But we are doing something radical.
Right.
We are stripping away every single ounce of religious sentimentality. We are not looking at this through the lens of theology or, personal piety or trying to earn invisible merits.
We're looking at this through the sharp, unsentimental lens of master sociologists and systems engineers.
Which is the only way to read the specific material without falling into a massive category error.
Absolutely. Because if we look at the source material provided, particularly Parwez's analysis, we immediately collide with how this text is universally understood today versus what the vocabulary actually demands.
Right, there's a huge disconnect.
A massive one. Let's look at the very first verse. Falah al-Mu'minun. Traditionally, universally, this is translated and taught as a promise of personal salvation.
Like a guarantee.
Right. The standard assumption is that if you are a ritual-observant individual, if you believe the right dogma in your heart, if you perform the right physical rituals at the right times, you, personally, as an individual, will prosper in the afterlife.
Okay.
But the text we are analyzing today fundamentally rejects this. It argues that this traditional view isn't just slightly off. It is a fundamental miscategorization of what the text is actually trying to achieve.
Hold on, I need to push back on this right out of the gate because we are talking about centuries of established tradition here.
I know, it's a huge shift.
Because the traditional reading makes the word mu'min a religious label.
Yeah.
It's like checking a box on a census form. You are either in the club or you aren't.
Exactly, a tribal identifier almost.
Right. But the sources you're bringing to the table are arguing that mu'min here is not a religious label at all. They're saying it is a civilizational type.
A very specific kind of functional human community.
So if we are completely discarding the religious club definition, what is our actual mission here today? Like, what are we looking for?
Our mission is extraction. We are extracting the minimum viable operating system of a functional human society from these 4 verses.
Minimum viable operating system. I love that phrasing.
Yeah, because the sources argue that this text isn't a map for getting into a spiritual utopia after you die. It is a blueprint for civilizational survival in the physical world, right here, right now.
So it's socio-economic.
Entirely. The Mu'min are not individuals who hold a specific theology. They are a community that operates on specific socioeconomic and psychological laws.
Okay, if we are extracting an operating system, the very first thing any systems engineer asks is, well, what is the output?
Right. What's it supposed to do?
Exactly. What is the civilizational machine actually supposed to produce? Because you can't evaluate a machine if you don't know what it's built to do.
And this brings us to a massive philosophical collision. It's the concept of traditional salvation versus the Quranic concept of Falah.
Falah.
Yeah. And to understand the magnitude of this shift, we really have to look at the bigger picture of human history. Because for millennia, human thought has been completely obsessed with the idea of escaping the physical world.
Oh, like the ancient Greeks.
Exactly.
Right.
Specifically the Orphic traditions or Plato's philosophy. They introduced the concept of the transmigration of the soul.
Right.
In that framework, the material world, the physical body, it was literally seen as a prison. It was a trap.
So the body is just something you're stuck in.
Yeah, a cage. And the ultimate goal of human existence was to escape the physical cycle, to shed the dirty material world and return to some pure, ethereal, universal soul.
Right, and you see that same exact architecture in Eastern philosophies, too.
Totally.
Like the Hindu concept of the cyclic nature of life reincarnation, the wheel of samsara. The physical world is viewed as an illusion, maya, or a burden.
Exactly.
And the ultimate goal, moksha or mukti, is to break out of that cycle, to stop being reborn, to escape the physical plane entirely.
It is a cyclic trap. The highest aspiration of humanity in these paradigms is to just get off the ride, to escape the material cycle.
Wow, okay.
And the source material we are looking at heavily critiques this. And it also extends this critique to the Christian concept of original sin.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, in that theological framework, humans are born inherently tainted.
Right.
You enter the world with a deficit, right? You're covered in a spiritual grime that you didn't even cause. It was inherited from Adam and Eve.
Right, so you start out in the negative.
Exactly. So the entire goal of salvation in that paradigm is merely to be cleansed, to be saved so you can get back to a baseline purity.
So you aren't building anything.
No, you are just trying to wash off the dirt you were born with.
Mm.
The source uses this brilliant analogy for this concept of salvation, a sanatorium.
I read that part of the notes, and the sanatorium analogy is incredibly striking. Let me see if I can map this out.
Go for it.
So traditional salvation is like a perfectly healthy person who suddenly contracts a terrible, debilitating disease. And because they are sick, they are sent away from their life, away from the city, to a sanatorium up in the mountains.
Yeah, total isolation.
And while they're there, they undergo all these rigorous, painful treatments. They suffer. They take bitter medicine. They're isolated. And finally, after years of this agonizing process, they're cured.
Okay.
They are discharged, they pack their bags, and they get to go home. And the result of all that suffering, all that time, is that they are exactly as they were before they got sick.
Exactly. Zero forward progress.
Just getting back to the baseline of not being ill, that's wild.
As you were. That is the defining phrase of the escapist paradigm. It is a stunning, devastating critique of traditional religious goals.
It really is.
Because whether it's the Greek transmigration, the Hindu wheel, or the concept of original sin, the ultimate achievement of your entire life struggle is just returning to a state of absolute zero.
You escaped the dirt. You survived the sickness. But what did you actually build?
Nothing. What did you add to the universe? Nothing. And this is where the linguistic root of the words aflaha and falah completely shatter this escapist paradigm.
Let's get into the linguistics then.
If you look at the classical Arabic dictionary, the root of aflaha does not come from the vocabulary of spiritual asceticism. It does not come from monks meditating in caves.
Where does it come from?
It comes directly from the vocabulary of farming and agriculture.
Wait, literal agriculture. Like we are talking about farmers.
Yes, the literal tilling of soil. Think of the words for farmer in Arabic, which is falah.
Okay, fella.
The verb aflaha describes the specific moment when a farmer's labor comes to fruition.
The harvest.
Exactly. It happens when a farmer takes raw, dormant, seemingly dead soil, breaks it open, prepares it, plants a seed, waters it, protects it from weeds and pests, and eventually that field yields a massive, tangible harvest.
So falah is the harvest.
Falah is the harvest. It is not escaping the field. It is maximizing the hidden potential of the field.
Let me just pause here because that completely flips the script. If you are listening to this, think about what this means. This ancient text isn't telling people to escape the physical world to reach some ethereal, floating spiritual utopia.
Right.
It is a mandate for optimizing the physical world itself. It's about socio-economic evolution. That is a radically different way to look at ancient wisdom.
It really is.
Instead of asking, how do I get out of this dirty material world? The question becomes, how do we grow something magnificent right here in the dirt?
And this agricultural reality ties directly into another major concept in the source material, the straight path, or Sirat-e-Mustaqeem.
Okay, how does that connect?
The text asks us to contrast the cyclic trap with the straight path. A cycle like the wheel of samsara, or the sanatorium, means you just go round and round until you hopefully jump off where you started.
Right.
But a straight path is linear progression. In linear evolution, every single step takes you further than the last. You never return to the starting point.
So it's about actualizing potential.
Yes. Life in this framework is about actualizing hidden potential. Just like a seed. Think about it. A single grain of wheat doesn't want to just sit in a glass jar on a shelf and remain a pure, uncontaminated grain of wheat.
Right. If it does that, it's useless.
It has failed. Its entire structural purpose is to be buried in the dark dirt, to struggle against the elements, to unlock its hidden genetic potential, and to become 100 grains.
That is a profound shift in perspective. But, I mean, it immediately raises a practical question.
Okay, what's that?
If Falah is this civilizational harvest, this tangible yield of human potential, then how do we guarantee the crop actually grows?
Right.
Because if I look at how religion traditionally operates, growth is usually reliant on praying for rain. It's reliant on some divine favor where you perform a ritual and you just hope the universe smiles on you and grants you a good crop. Are the sources saying there's a different mechanism at play here?
They're saying the exact opposite of the traditional view. Yes. The sources argue that Surah Al-Mu'minun is not a theological bargain. It is not a promise made by a deity to a group of people performing rituals.
Then what is it?
It is a statement of social physics. It is the law of requital, or the Arabic terminology used by Parwez, mukafate amal.
Mukafate amal, the law of requital.
It is a declaration of absolute unbending cause and effect. Think about it. The universe operates on laws. If you are a farmer and you follow the agricultural laws, if you provide the right ambient heat, the exact required amount of water, the necessary mineral protection, the seed must grow.
Because that's just how biology works.
Exactly. It is physically obligated to grow. It doesn't matter what the farmer's personal theology is.
That's a great point.
The soil doesn't ask for your religious credentials before it germinates a seed. The soil asks for water and labor.
Okay, I see where you're going, but let me challenge that.
Go.
If the soil doesn't care about your labels, how does this text define the internal state of the people who are supposed to be building this civilization? Because you can't just have a society of unthinking robots.
True.
Traditional translations talk heavily about the word iman, and iman is almost universally translated as belief or faith, which, usually implies blind faith in the unseen. Believing in things without evidence.
Right.
How does that fit into a system of strict social physics?
In the context of this operating system, the concept of iman is fundamentally redefined.
Okay.
The source material insists that translating it as blind faith or passive intellectual agreement is a major distortion.
So what does it mean?
Iman, in this civilizational context, is the absolute, unshakable conviction of the farmer that the seed in his hand actually contains the potential to yield a harvest.
Oh, wow. So it's rooted in reality.
Yes. It's a conviction based on knowledge and laws.
Yeah.
If the farmer doesn't have that conviction, he simply won't wake up at dawn to till the soil.
Because why bother?
Exactly. He has to believe in the potential of the seed, which represents the potential of humanity. But, and this is the hinge upon which the whole system turns, conviction alone produces absolutely nothing.
Right.
You can stare at a seed on your kitchen table with all the faith in the universe. You can chant over it. You can cry over it. But it will never sprout on a wooden table.
Right. Conviction without action is just daydreaming. Let's try to map this to something intensely modern.
Okay, I like that.
Think about a tech startup. You are a founder, and you have absolute belief, your version of Ipaman, that your code, your new software architecture is going to revolutionize an industry.
We're convinced.
You have absolute conviction. You've pitched it to venture capitalists. You believe in the math. You believe in the market need.
Right.
But if you do not actually sit down at the keyboard, stay up late, and type the code line by line, your startup is dead on arrival.
Absolutely dead.
The belief has to be paired with rigorous, methodical execution.
That is an excellent modern parallel. And that execution, that typing of the code, is what the text calls amali salah.
Amali salah.
Now, traditionally, you will hear amali salah translated as good deeds or righteous acts.
Which, again, sounds very moralistic. It sounds like, helping an old lady cross the street or giving $1 to charity.
Exactly. It shrinks the concept down to personal sentimentality. But functionally, in a systems engineering framework, amali thala means constructive, systemic action that aligns perfectly with the laws of nature to bring that seed to its full fruition.
Constructive action.
The root of the word sala implies repairing, improving, and making something functional. It is the labor that actualizes the potential.
So it's not just being nice.
No. You have the conviction, the iman, and you pair it with the scientifically aligned labor, the amali sala. The two cannot be separated.
So if we look at the contrast between societies through this lens, the source material draws a really sharp, almost brutal line here.
It does.
If you have a society that understands this social physics, this absolute law of cause and effect, they plant the seed, they do the systemic work, they build the infrastructure, and they reap the civilizational harvest. They get Falah.
They get the harvest.
But what happens to a society that just reads this text as a religious promise? What happens when they convert these incredibly dynamic social principles into mere ritual compliance?
The text is uncompromising on this point. If a society thinks, oh, if I just chant the right words over the barren field, the harvest will miraculously appear, the result is inevitable.
Right.
The society grows poorer in every conceivable metric. Economically, intellectually, scientifically, socially, they atrophy.
Because they're waiting for magic.
Exactly. Why? Because they are actively ignoring the law of requital.
Yeah.
They're sitting in the dirt waiting for miraculous intervention. Meanwhile, the society next door, which might not even claim to hold this text sacred, which might not even know what the text says, is actually implementing the cause and effect principles.
They're actually doing the work.
They're utilizing hard work, scientific inquiry, and systemic organization. And according to the laws of social physics, the latter society gets the harvest.
The universe rewards the aligned action.
It does not reward the ritual simulation of action.
This is fascinating because it forces you to look under the hood of how a society operates. Knowing these broad laws of cause and effect is great, but what are the specific internal mechanics of this civilizational machine?
Right. How does it actually run?
Yeah. If we are building this operating system from the text, how does it actually manage its energy? Because any system, whether it's an internal combustion engine or a human community of 10 million people, survives or dies based on how it manages energy.
And that takes us directly into the specific variables of this operating system, found in the next two verses.
Okay, break them down.
Verse 2 gives us the variable of focus, encapsulated in the word kushu. Verse 3 gives us the variable of efficiency, encapsulated in the avoidance of law. Let's start with the kushu. The text says that the successful community, the mu'minun, are those who are kashun in their salat.
Okay, let me stop you there, because we are hitting another massive traditional roadblock.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
If you ask almost anyone today, salat is translated as the 5 daily prayers, and kushu is translated as having a bowed head, deeply humble, almost fearful state during those physical prayers.
Right.
A passive, submissive, quiet state, like keeping your eyes glued to the floor, speaking softly, and looking incredibly pious.
And this is where the sociological analysis of the text violently dismantles the traditional view.
Oh, so?
If we follow the logic we've already established, that this is a civilizational blueprint, not a personal piety checklist, then salat cannot merely be a private ritual prayer.
That makes sense.
The sources argue that salat in this context refers to the establishment of a systemic, organized society. It is the community moving in total sync, following the laws of the system.
So salat is the societal order itself.
Yes. So if salat is the systemic societal order, then what is kushu? Kushu cannot be passive humility. The analysis argues that kushu is the total, laser-focused engagement of a system operating at peak coherence.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the shift from passive humility to peak coherence. How do the sources justify that linguistically?
They justify it by looking at the deeper linguistic roots of related words in classical Arabic. For instance, the source brings up the root of the word sabaha.
Sabaha, I recognize that term. Usually people translate that as glorifying or specifically using rosary beads, chanting a word over and over while moving beads on a string.
Yes, that is the ritualized outcome centuries later. But linguistically, in its original classical Arabic context, the root of sabaha referred to a galloping horse.
Wait, really?
Yes, or it referred to someone swimming against a fierce current with all their might.
That is a wildly different image.
Think of the visceral image of a galloping horse. It is an entity straining every single nerve, flaring its nostrils, focusing every ounce of muscular and kinetic energy toward a singular overriding goal.
It's all forward momentum.
It is active, dynamic, and physically exhausting.
Wow. A galloping horse is the literal antithesis of sitting quietly in a corner with a bowed head. It's pure kinetic energy. It's power.
Exactly. So Kushu, in this systemic civilizational context, means that the individuals within the society are operating like that galloping horse for the goals of the community.
They are completely dialed in.
They are deeply, intensely focused. And there's a vital psychological component to this that the sources highlight.
What's that?
Kushu means internalizing the law of the system. It means you are no longer obeying the laws of the society out of fear of the police or fear of state punishment.
Ah, so it's not coerced.
Right. Obeying a law just because a cop is watching is mere evasion. You were just avoiding punishment. Kushu means the duties and responsibilities of the system become the profound internal demand of the individual's own heart.
So it's the difference between a citizen who doesn't steal because there's a security camera pointing directly at them versus a citizen who doesn't steal because they fundamentally, intellectually, and emotionally believe that stealing damages the structural integrity of the community they love.
Exactly.
The first person is just complying under threat. The second person possesses Kushu.
Precisely. And from a systems engineering perspective, the difference in energy expenditure between those two societies is staggering.
How do you mean?
Well, a society built entirely on compliance requires massive resources, police forces, courts, sprawling prison complexes, ubiquitous surveillance, just to maintain a baseline of order.
Oh, I see. It wastes energy policing itself.
Exactly. A society operating with Kushu is self-regulating. The energy is focused on building and expanding, not policing and punishing.
That is incredibly efficient.
But to maintain that incredible focus, you have to ruthlessly eliminate waste. And that brings us to the next variable in verse 3, law.
Right. Verse 3 says, the successful community turns away from law. Again, the standard translations I usually see for law are idle gossip, frivolous talk, or vain things.
Right.
Like, don't waste your time playing board games. Don't chatter with your neighbors about the weather. Don't listen to music.
And that is the neutered, hyper-individualized interpretation.
So what's the systemic reading?
When you view this as a civilizational operating system, law is far more dangerous than just playing a board game. In a systems engineering context, law represents wasted productive energy.
Wasted energy.
It is any action, any policy, any cultural habit, any economic structure that does not serve the system's overarching purpose. It is non-productive exertion. It is energy spent that yields no harvest.
In engineering terms, law sounds exactly like friction.
Friction, yes.
If you have a massive engine, friction isn't just an annoyance. It's not just a minor squeak that slows the machine down a little bit. If left unchecked, friction generates heat. That heat warps the metal. It actively destroys the machine over time.
That is exactly what happens.
Is the text fundamentally saying that a society that tolerates purposeless energy, a society that entertains itself to death or pours billions of dollars into unproductive dead ends, is literally wearing its own gears down to dust?
That is an impeccable analogy, and it scales up perfectly to the societal level. Yes.
Wow.
A society that expends its intellectual and physical capital on endless internal political bickering, on superficial entertainment that numbs the populace, on massive bureaucracies that produce no tangible human development. That society is generating massive amounts of friction.
They are engaging in law.
Yes. The Mu'min society, the functional civilizational type described here, is ruthless about eliminating systemic waste.
Why?
Because they understand that energy, time, and resources are finite.
You can't just waste it.
If you are galloping like a horse toward a civilizational goal, you cannot afford to carry 1,000 pounds of useless weight. You have to be aerodynamic.
Okay, if you are listening to this, apply this to your own life or your own company. We have absolute belief in the potential of the seed. We have the scientifically aligned labor to grow it.
Right. We have a society operating with laser focus, internalizing the mission so they don't need constant policing, and they are ruthlessly eliminating all systemic friction.
It's a powerful machine.
A machine running that smoothly, operating with total focus and zero friction, is going to produce a staggering amount of power. It's going to generate a massive surplus of energy, resources, and wealth.
Inevitably.
So what happens to that surplus? Because historically, a surplus of wealth is exactly what destroys empires. It leads to corruption, greed, and collapse. How does this operating system prevent itself from choking on its own success?
This is the critical juncture where almost all historical civilizations fail, and it brings us to the core economic engine of this system, found in verse 4, the principle of circulation, encapsulated in the word Zaka.
Zaka. Okay, if there is one term in this text that everyone thinks they understand, it's Zaka.
They really do.
The traditional, unquestioned view is that Zaka is charity. It's a religious tax. Specifically, it's a fixed 2.5% tax on your accumulated, uninvested wealth, and you hand it out to the poor once a year. Right.
You pay your 2.5%, you feel good about yourself, you've purified your money, and you've checked the religious box.
And the source material argues, with incredible force, that reducing Zaka to a fixed 2.5% annual charity is a profound, almost fatal misunderstanding of the operating system.
Wait, fatal?
Yes. In this analysis, Zaka is absolutely not charity.
Wait, are you seriously saying Zaka isn't charity? That is a cornerstone of how the religion is practiced by over 1 billion people.
I am saying that in a functional socio-economic operating system, charity is fundamentally inadequate.
Why?
Charity implies a power dynamic. It implies a wealthy upper class bestowing crumbs upon a permanent underclass.
Oh, I see. It keeps the hierarchy intact.
Exactly. It is a temporary alleviation of symptoms, giving a starving man a meal, while the underlying disease, the systemic inequality, remains completely intact.
So if it's not charity, what is it?
Zaka, in its linguistic root and its systemic function, is the fundamental economic principle of circulation. It is the compulsory purging of idle capital back into the productive cycle.
Compulsory purging. That is aggressive language. That doesn't sound like dropping a few coins in a donation box.
It has to be aggressive.
Yeah.
Because the principle is biological in its necessity. Wealth that pools, wealth that stagnates in the hands of a few elites or corporations, literally destroys the organism that produced it.
Because it's not moving.
Right. If you look at the Arabic phrasing in verse 4, it explicitly states Failun lizaka. It describes the Mu'minun as doers or executors of Zaka.
It uses an active verb.
An active verb form. This implies a systemic, organized, state-level effort. It requires a structured government or authority. The text refers to this later in the chapter as in makanahum fil ard, meaning when they are given authority or establishment in the land.
So this isn't just me as an individual handing a $20 bill to someone on the street to clear my conscience.
Not at all.
This is a massive macroeconomic policy.
Exactly. It requires a centralized mechanism, historically referred to as a state treasury or a Beit Mal.
Let's pause on that term, Beit Mal. What does that literally translate to, and how did it function?
Literally, Beit means house, and Mal means wealth or property. The house of wealth.
Okay.
But crucially, this treasury is not a vault for a king or a sovereign wealth fund designed to hoard gold for the government.
It's not Scrooge McDuck's fault.
Right, no. In this operating system, the Beit al-Mal is a circulation mechanism. Its entire purpose is to receive the surplus capital generated by the society's efficiency and immediately redeploy it to ensure the total physical, intellectual, and social nourishment of humanity.
It acts like a pump.
Exactly. The linguistic root of Zaka involves growth, purification, and development. You simply cannot develop human potential if the necessary resources are locked away in stagnant pools, inaccessible to the masses.
So how does this view reconcile with the traditional rules? Because there are very specific historical laws about this. For example, I've read that Zaka is calculated on 52 talas of silver.
Oh, yeah.
Where does that come from, and how does the source material critique it? And for that matter, what even is a tola?
A tola is an ancient South Asian unit of mass, roughly equivalent to about 11.6 grams. Okay, very specific.
Very. Historically, religious scholars, attempting to codify Zaka centuries ago, fixated on these arbitrary static numbers. They decreed that if you owned a certain fixed amount of gold or a certain number of camels or 52 tolas of silver, you owed a specific percentage.
And what does the source material say about that?
The source material offers a devastating critique of this fixed ritual approach.
Right, because economies change. A fixed measure of silver from the 7th or 8th century means absolutely nothing in a 21st century digital fiat currency world.
Nothing at all.
A society based on agrarian barter is entirely different from a society based on high-frequency algorithmic trading.
Precisely. The economic systems change, the modes of production change, the nature of currency changes. Therefore, the principle of Zaka cannot be a fixed magical percentage applied universally across all time and space.
That makes so much sense.
The core principle, the immutable law of the operating system, is that the state must regulate capital so that absolutely no individual is starved of the resources they need to reach their full human potential. So the percentage isn't the point.
No. If the society has a surplus, that surplus must be circulated to wherever there's a deficit in human development. If that requires circulating 2.5% in a booming economy, fine.
But what if times are tough?
If a crisis hits and it requires circulating 50% or 100% of the surplus to keep the society from collapsing, then that is what Zaka demands. The goal is circulation, not a mathematical ritual.
Let me throw a biological analogy at you because this concept of circulation feels so visceral to me.
Let's hear it.
If capital, money, resources, energy is the blood of a civilization, then the traditional view of Zaka is like donating a pint of blood to the Red Cross once a year so you get a sticker and feel morally superior.
Oh, that's good.
But the systemic view of Zaka is that it is the cardiovascular system itself. The heart's entire purpose, its only reason for existing, is to keep the blood moving. If the blood stops circulating and pools in one organ, say the wealthiest 1% of a society, that organ swells and gets a massive tumor. And the rest of the body, deprived of oxygen and nutrients, literally dies of necrosis. The tissue rots.
It just decays.
And eventually the tumor dies too because the host organism is dead.
That is exactly what the source is arguing, and the biological analogy is flawless. Pooling wealth is civilizational necrosis.
Necrosis? That's a strong word.
But it's accurate. When capital stops circulating, society starts rotting from the edges inward. Extreme poverty, violent crime, lack of access to education, systemic disease, these are not just isolated, unfortunate events. They are the direct symptoms of a failing cardiovascular system in the body politic.
They're a sign the system is failing.
The operating system outlined in these verses demands total, unceasing circulation to keep the society healthy, adaptable, and growing.
So if we step back and look at the whole picture, we have a blueprint here that is incredibly potent. Absolute conviction paired with scientific labor. A society moving with the laser focus of a galloping horse. The ruthless elimination of systemic friction and waste. And the compulsory total circulation of economic surplus to maximize human potential.
Right.
It's a flawless blueprint for civilizational success. It addresses psychology, physics, and macroeconomics. So the blindingly obvious question is, why did we lose this?
Yeah, that's the big question.
If you have the manual for a nuclear reactor, why are millions of people chanting the equations around a campfire? How did the modern understanding stray so far into mere ritualism?
This is perhaps the most important part of the analysis. It takes us to the sociology of how revolutionary social manifestos are neutralized over time.
Neutralized.
And it almost always follows a specific, predictable historical pattern. When a system of thought is introduced that threatens the status quo, when it demands that wealth must circulate, that people must be deeply engaged and not distracted by frivolous entertainment, that blind faith in authority must be replaced by scientific cause and effect, the vested interests push back.
Because the people hoarding the wealth don't want the cardiovascular system to pump it away from them.
Obviously.
The people in power like the friction because it keeps the masses distracted.
Exactly. But here is the genius of the vested interests. You can't always just burn the manifesto.
Sometimes it's too popular.
Right. Sometimes the text is too popular, too revered. So instead of destroying it, you neuter it. You domesticate it.
How do you do that?
The sociology breaks down into 3 distinct steps. Step 1, privatization. The vested interests interpret the systemic societal laws as personal individual practices. It's no longer about how the state organizes its economy or eliminates poverty. It's just about how you personally behave in the privacy of your own home.
That shrinks the blast radius of the ideas immediately. It takes a geopolitical threat and turns it into a self-help routine.
Exactly. Step 2, ritualization. They convert those personal practices into rigid, repetitive, physical rituals.
So it's not even a lifestyle anymore, it's just a set of motions.
Right. Zaka goes from the compulsory systemic circulation of all surplus capital to give 2.5% of your savings to charity once a year. Zaka goes from establishing a highly cohesive, focused societal order to performing specific physical bowing motions a few times a day. It becomes a checklist.
And once it's a rigid, complex ritual checklist, you have a new problem. Someone has to be the expert on exactly how to perform the ritual.
Yes.
You need someone to tell you if you bowed at the right angle or if you calculated your tolas of silver correctly.
Which is step 3, monopolization. The creation of the priesthood.
The clergy.
The vested interest, the religious clerical class, becomes the sole gatekeeper of the rituals. They write endless volumes of jurisprudence on exactly how far to bow, exactly what talas of silver to calculate, exactly how to wash your hands before the ritual.
They control the manual.
And whoever controls the ritual controls the believers. It is a brilliant, insidious trap.
It really is.
By defining the Mu'min by mere belief, or by their ability to check off a list of highly specific rituals, you create a docile, easily manipulated populace. You actively prevent the society from ever achieving the true Falah, the harvest of human potential, because the people are too busy arguing over the minutiae of the rituals to actually build the civilization.
It's the ultimate historical irony. You can see this happening across so many different cultures.
It's a universal pattern.
It's like finding a blueprint for a rocket ship. It's got the propulsion systems, the life support, the navigational algorithms, everything you need to explore the stars.
Right.
And instead of mining the metal and building the rocket, a group of people decide to revere the blueprint. They trace the schematics onto delicate paper over and over again. They fold those tracings into little paper airplanes. They throw them around the room. They judge who threw theirs the furthest. And then they sit back and wonder why they haven't reached the moon.
That is exactly what happened.
They are holding the very instructions for spaceflight, but they've turned it into a kindergarten craft project.
And if you point out to them that they aren't on the moon, that their society is crumbling, their response is usually, we just need to fold the paper airplanes more precisely. We need to trace the lines harder. We aren't performing the rituals well enough.
So they double down on the fake version.
They double down on the simulacra, completely missing the systemic reality. The source text we are analyzing today insists that the Mu'minin are not described by what they passively believe. They are defined purely by what they do and how they organize themselves economically and socially. It is an active, structural definition, not a passive theological one.
So let's bring it all together. For you listening, we've covered a massive amount of philosophical and sociological ground today.
We really have.
Let's synthesize this operating system so you can see the architecture clearly.
Okay. If we look at the first 4 ayats of Surah Al-Mu'minun as the minimum viable operating system of a functional human community, we have 3 distinct interdependent variables.
All right, what's variable 1?
Variable 1, focused energy, or Khushu, the galloping horse. A society deeply aligned with its purpose, operating at peak coherence, self-regulating from within.
Variable 2.
Variable 2, elimination of systemic waste, or law avoidance. Eradicating the friction of purposeless activities, endless bureaucracies, and unproductive energy.
And variable 3.
Variable 3, circulating capital, or Zaka. Ensuring the economic lifeblood of the society reaches every single cell, allowing total human potential to flourish and preventing the necrosis of pooled wealth.
Focus, efficiency, and circulation. It's elegant. It's entirely rational. There's nothing superstitious about it.
And here is the synthesis of permanence and change, which is vital for any operating system. These 3 variables, focus, efficiency, circulation, are the permanent, immutable principles.
But how you apply them changes.
Exactly. How you apply them must constantly change, based on the era, the technology, and the environment. If you freeze these variables into rigid, unchanging rituals from the 7th century, you kill the civilization. You end up in the sanatorium going through painful motions with 0 forward progress.
Right.
But if you apply them as living, adaptable social principles, if you as a society constantly ask, how do we best circulate capital today in a digital economy? How do we eliminate systemic friction today in an age of social media distraction? Then you achieve the civilizational harvest. You get Falah.
And the stakes here are incredibly high. If you're listening to this on your commute or at your desk, think about how this applies to your world. Whether you are analyzing the geopolitical trajectory of a nation state, looking at the internal culture of a massive Fortune 500 corporation, or just evaluating your own local community, these laws of social physics apply universally.
Absolutely universally.
Focus, efficiency, and circulation. If a corporation has no focus, wastes all its energy on internal politics and friction, and hoards its resources at the executive level while the workers on the floor starve, that corporation is going to collapse.
The physics demand it.
It's a universal prerequisite for systemic survival.
It is the inescapable law of requital, kafat e amal. The universe does not negotiate with our rituals. The universe does not care how beautifully we chant. It only responds to our systemic actions.
So we want to leave you with a chilling question to mull over, a thought experiment to take with you into the rest of your week.
It's a tough one.
Look at the world today. Look specifically at the societies, the cultures, and the nations claiming to hold these ancient texts as sacred, claiming to revere these very verses above all else.
Right, the ones who trace the blueprints.
Are those societies actually organized around these three functional principles of socio-economic survival? Are they defined by laser focus, the ruthless elimination of systemic friction, and the total equitable circulation of wealth? Or are they entirely organized around the rigid ritual simulacra of those principles? And if it's the latter, according to the strict, unbending laws of social physics we've discussed today, what is their inevitable harvest?
It's a question that demands an honest, entirely unsentimental answer. Because the data is already there.
Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how beautifully you recite the manual. If you treat the schematics for a nuclear reactor like a book of poetry,
You're not going to get power.
you're just waiting for the meltdown.
You can't cheat physics.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.